if you only take one thing from this podcast about nanotech to remember is that nano, yes, it means really, really small, a billionth of a meter in scale, but it also means fundamentally different. It means particles that are imbued because of their size with different physical and chemical properties than their larger bulk comparators.
Food, like life, can be complicated. That's why I'm on a quest to learn all about our food and the crimes, issues, and debates that are tied to it. I hope you'll join me on my quest to explore the dark side of dining. When most of us hear the words nanoparticle or nanotechnology, our minds go to the fancy sci-fi things of the future, like nanobots. While most of us may think that the era of nanotechnology is still far in the future, this particular field has been making its way into something shockingly commonplace for decades now: food. That's right, while we've been looking to the future for nanotechnology, it's been right by our side all along, and not necessarily in a positive way. That's why I brought on George Kimbrell, an expert in food-related policies and issues. But I'll let George introduce himself.
Welcome on to the dark side of dining. Super excited to have you here, George. So just to kind of get started, I would love to get to know kind of some of your background, like what led you into working with food, and like how long have you been involved in this kind of niche of the world?
So I'm an environmental lawyer by training. I've worked for the Center for Food Safety and in the nonprofit sector for 2 decades plus now, about 21 years. Even before law school, I did work in the environmental public interest sector. So I come to the food world from the perspective of, wanting to have a career to protect the earth and public health from the harms of human modern industrial society generally. What I didn't realize several decades ago is that the most environmentally important decision we make every day is how we eat and what we put in our bodies and how we shop and the footprint of that. And so really food law, modern 21st century food law, and agriculture law, which is mostly what we focus on here at Center for Food Safety, is, a 21st century outcropping of environmental law. And that's a lot of what we do. So I'm a litigator. I represent our own nonprofit and 1 million members of our organization and other nonprofits as well, or other entities and individuals in litigation to address the harms of industrial agriculture on public health and on the environment, covering everything in the food system from farm to fork. So that includes everything from pesticides and synthetic inputs in monocultures to genetically engineered crops and animals, to confined animal feeding operations and, their pollution of groundwater and surface water, and the animal welfare issues of them, to aquaculture and the oceans, to truth in labeling and the consumer's right to know in what they feed their families, to foodborne illness and food safety issues. So, you name it, we do it here in the food system reform, trying to, as I said, our mission as an organization is to dismantle industrial agriculture and promote and champion a more regenerative food future. That's our little niche part of it.
To say George is involved in our food would be an understatement. He and his colleagues at the Center for Food Safety deal with just about every food system concern under the sun, so he knows his stuff. But in contacting George, one aspect of his work really fascinated me, and that is nanotechnology and its relationship to our food. So I asked George to explain to me what nanotechnology has to do with our food, and a bit about why it might be a concern.
I never would have expected nanotechnology to be a thing with food, I guess. So could you kind of explain what nanotechnology means in the realm of kind of food safety and that sort of thing, and kind of why it's important that we are aware of it, and what health risks there might be there?
Yeah, I think the thing with nano, so we've had a program on nanotechnology since around 2006 or so. So it's not necessarily something that's new. We have some more materials on our website about it, and there are a few other groups that have worked on it. I don't think it's as prominent an issue as a lot of other flagship issues we've worked on. It's still one where the public is increasingly becoming more and more aware of it. But I think theoretically, it's of a piece with a lot of other novel technologies that we use in the food systems. I mean, I think the most important thing, if you only take one thing from this podcast about nanotech to remember, is that nano, yes, it means really, really small, a billionth of a meter in scale, but it also means fundamentally different. It means particles that are imbued because of their size with different physical and chemical properties than their larger bulk comparators. So nanosilver has different properties than bulk silver, to give one prominent example. And so, you're not just talking about things that are really small, you're talking about things that are different in terms of the exciting part for industry is like, the gee whiz hype part of it is that, yeah, there's enhanced strength and other properties that these materials may have. And I think from a human health and environmental risk perspective, it's the flip side of the coin, which is that there are different and increased risks from the particles as compared to their larger brethren. And the most important part, so there's a lot we don't know about what those risks are because it is, as I said, still fairly new. It's a 21st century technology. And since we don't have a lot of our risk systems set up for data in terms of accounting for those risks, and we don't have labeling, it's a bit of the causation issues are still pretty unknown. But what the scientific consensus has shown now since around, like I said, 2006 or 2007, is that it's impossible to predict the risks for nanoparticles from their larger brethren. And so we can't just assume their safety based on testing that's done on particles, zinc oxide in its larger form versus nano-sized zinc oxide, for example. So, the reasons are, I mean, you can kind of look at examples of what those risks might be. I mean, one of the easiest ones to understand is the mobility part of it. If anybody's ever seen, like, I remember when I was a kid, I want to show my age here, but there's the movie they show you in school, Fantastic Voyage, where they shrink these scientists down into a submarine and inject them into the human body and they like fly around in there. I mean, basically nanoparticles, due to their size, have this unprecedented mobility. They can pass the placenta, the blood-brain barrier, and have other access in our bodies that larger particles can't.
So nanoparticles can get places other particles can't, and they act differently at the nanoscale. Now, I should note here that George gave me an example of how nanoparticles have been used in sunscreen. And while that in and of itself was a very interesting conversation, it had little to do with food, so I've omitted it here. George continued to explain to me what some of the other factors are that affect nanoparticles.
So besides mobility, there's an increased toxicity with these materials. So I should say the mobility also goes in the environment. The risks to the environment are very similar in terms of the size. So there's uptake into the soils and other areas where once the material is flushed, sunscreen is washed off, or you have another product that's thrown away and it goes out into the environment. There's an unprecedented level of mobility there in terms of soils and waterways and things like that. Again, due to the very small size of these engineered materials. So the other area of risk is increased intrinsic toxicity of the materials. And the easiest way to think about that is that basically they have a vastly increased surface area for their size. So you can think about it with think about like a big rock, and most of the rock that you have is the surface area is just limited to the outside pieces of it, and then the inside is not touching anything because it's encased. And then break that rock into like 1,000,000 pieces or 100 pieces even. Now you have a lots of different surface area from the same bulk material. And so whatever the activity or toxicity of that material was previously, there's an increased amount of it that's going to be touching the environment and reaching out to it. And again, so another example of consumer products that you see is silver. Silver's been used as an antimicrobial in products for centuries. It's known to have these microbial properties. But with engineered nanoparticles of silver, it dramatically increases that toxicity and antimicrobial properties for the same reason as I said. And so you see a lot of consumer products. Some of the early ones were antimicrobial socks or antimicrobial food packaging materials that would say, okay, your food will stay fresh in this plastic Tupperware essentially for longer in your fridge because we've imbued the Tupperware with nanosilver particles in this way. And of course, again, like once it gets out into the environment, the concern is the same, is that now you have these smaller, more mobile, and more toxic particles. And what are those going to do in nature to microorganisms, to natural systems that, we haven't studied the risks of and are going to create new risks from. So I think mobility and increased intrinsic toxicity are kind of the two groups of risks. And you can put that in the health and in the environment kind of context.
I found it interesting how nanosilver has been used to preserve food, and I wanted to know if there were any other reasons why companies might be pushing nanoparticles. So I asked George about that. Here's what he had to say.
So it's mostly been in food packaging. I want to be clear about that. I don't think we've seen a lot of examples actually in food of engineered nanoparticles to this point that we know of. Again, the caveats being there's no labeling and FDA hasn't required much in the way of different nano-specific oversight, which is a lot of the things we called on the agency to do over the years with legal actions and otherwise. But yeah, I think for the most part, it's a pesticidal effect. I say microbial, but I want to be clear that a lot of the ways in which antimicrobials act they are an intentional toxin that we are introducing into the food system or introducing into the environment for a purpose, to kill a pest of some kind, whether it be bacteria or insects or a weed that we want to kill. And the trade-off to that is like it kills a bunch of good stuff too. And we're intentionally introducing that toxic substance into the environment. We see the same thing with herbicides or with insecticides. So, with nanosilver, the question is, in addition to whatever its purposes are, we know it's not going to stay in the packaging. It's going to leach out of it. It's going to go out into the environment. What are the effects are going to have then on microorganisms in the environment? But yeah, that's been one of the two major thrusts, I think, of commercialization would be the two I've already discussed about the sunscreens and nanosilver kind of food packaging in terms of the food system. And so I think on the sunscreens, it's an environmental risk profile and a human health risk profile. And on the nanosilver, it's more an environmental risk concern.
At this point in the conversation, I felt like I had a pretty good handle on the potential harm that could come from nanoparticles. So I was curious about the efforts George and others have made towards regulation and labeling, and what obstacles they face when it comes to that. Here's what he had to say.
Yeah. So let me just correct myself. I would say sunscreens is where we focused one of our early legal actions, because there were legal hooks there that didn't apply to other sectors in which you're seeing nanomaterials come through, and that's cosmetics. And it's not to me a surprise, because basically in America, cosmetics are almost entirely unregulated, like writ large. FDA, they're self-regulated, so unregulated in terms of how that industry is overseen. And so when you have novel products, novel new technologies, they tend to find those less regulated areas and flow to those areas first and foremost. So I would say the personal care sector is the sector in which you see the most engineered nanomaterials. And of course, those tend to be, things that have a very close relationship to the human body. Like we're putting those things directly onto our body, whatever they are, whether they are, sunscreens or cosmetics and personal care products, when we've tried to do an accounting of these over the years. And I think your question goes more broadly to like what role this has in the larger universe of oversight, and why we haven't had any actions on them in terms of labeling or risk assessment. And I think the answer is because in America, that's been in the United States, that's been really not the way we've approached regulation for a couple decades now. So in Europe, for example, they have laws and regulations that are much more precautionary in their approach. So you don't need to have the evidence of harm to health or the environment before you can regulate. And instead, the burden is on the manufacturer to come forward with evidence of safety before those materials are let out into the marketplace and approved by the regulator. In the US, we have a little of that. It depends on the agency, but for the most part, especially with food at FDA, that doesn't exist. And instead, it's reversed, and there's a burden to show harm before anything is regulated. And the default is that something is going to be let, especially in sectors like cosmetics, is going to be let out into the environment and use into the marketplace before we regulate it. Same thing with labeling. Other places, there's more of a directive to provide information because there is interest, or, there is a right to know that's codified in law and regulation in a way. And in the States, we've really had to fight for that, and we've gotten it in some places. But for the most part, there is not that same existing right for consumers and for the public in terms of transparency in both, the consumer product sector, but also the food product sector. And there needs to be, some other reason that the agency has for labeling. So what we've argued with nano, like we've argued with genetic engineering and a lot of other technologies in the food system, is just what I started the conversation with, which is like, yeah, there's plenty of legitimate reasons. We think the science is, universally consensus is that they're different and create different risk profiles, and people deserve the right to decide whether they want to be exposed to that, whether they want to eat that, whether they want to buy those products or not.
Since we started to talk about food labeling, I asked George what his ideal would be when it comes to food labeling and what issues there have been with labeling in general.
I think it would be very simple. On package. So one of the problems that we're seeing right now with food labeling is that there's a battle over the package. And so I have another case on genetically engineered food labeling that I argued last fall to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's about the bioengineered label, which is a 2016 law that Congress passed after about 12 years of work from us and some other colleagues to get finally genetically engineered food labeled. And one of the battles in that case that we won was the manufacturers tried to put it all in a QR code, where you would essentially have to walk through a grocery store with your smartphone. First of all, you'd have to have a smartphone, which is, I think pretty discriminatory. And you'd have to have broadband internet, which a lot of rural places don't. You'd have to be able to use a smartphone, which if you're like me and a Luddite, is hard enough. And then the practical kind of idea, I have a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old at home, of like walking through the grocery store and scanning every single food. It's just impracticable nobody's going to do that. But the idea of the manufacturers is like, let's put all of the not exciting, not advertising on this QR code, and let's have the rest of the package for our gee whiz advertising. And so, the bioengineered label is the camel under the tent in terms of the first effort to put government mandated information on this QR code. And what ideally they would want is everything would be there, the calorie count, the ingredient list, and you would have the whole package for Captain Crunch or whoever the little cartoon character is, or whatever you have on there that's trying to sell your product. And then if you want the other stuff that they are required to put on there, you've got to go to your QR code. So I think the first step for nano or any kind of labeling to us is, no, it should be on package. It should be text labeling. It should be clearly labeled. And the easy answer is just have it say, this is made with engineered nanoparticles, or on the ingredients list, if it has a nano version of some ingredient in it, then list nano version of this, and, give a disclaimer if there are risks involved that we don't know about in a precautionary way. FDA does no testing, asterisk, and then down at the bottom, something that says FDA has done no testing on this, or if they have, what it says, basic information like that. But I think nano would be the start. It would be on packaging, not kind of in a secondary form like we're seeing with these battles for QR codes right now, and just give consumers the choice. It wouldn't be necessarily risk labeling, because we don't label things where we know risks are inherent to consumers, whether it's health of the environment, we take those off the market, right? I mean, that's what we should do. We shouldn't be like, this is bad for you. Those things should be removed.
So we need better labeling so people can be aware of what they're consuming. With this in mind, I asked George if he had any parting advice or resources for our listeners.
So just last kind of question, kind of going to the practical side of things, I guess. What advice would you give our listeners about how to be more conscientious about like nanotechnology in the food that they consume? And then like, where can they go to learn more about this and other issues?
Yeah, I mean, as terms of where you can go, I think, our website and Friends of the Earth would be two good websites that have good material on this topic. And then I think in terms of, with your food purchases, what I usually will tell people is try to have a relationship to your food generally. So, go to the farmer's market, grow your own food, get to know the people that are growing your food. And that's the number one best way. Not everybody can do that. And I understand the privilege in that, but that's one way to really understand where it's coming from. Second best is, again, with the privilege understood, buying organic food. Organic is one of the labels that does prohibit nanomaterials and genetic engineering and pesticides in it. So it's not perfect. It has some challenges, but when you see the USDA certified organic label, we've worked very hard for 20 years plus now to defend the integrity of that label. That's one. I think, there's the non-GMO blue butterfly that you see in terms of private certification labels. That's another label that we support and we think is one that you can count on in terms of private labels. Other private labels, it's hard to know. Sometimes it can really be the Wild West, and there's ones that can be very misleading. Natural is kind of the classic example of that, where manufacturers essentially can put natural on anything that they can think they can get away with since it has no recognized legal definition. So, those would be the advice I would give to your listeners. And like I said, you can join our organization. It's free to join. You'll get our email blasts and other things on this topic and many other topics in terms of consumer awareness and engagement in trying to join us in building a better future for our food.
From nanoparticles in sunscreen and food packaging to the need for better food labeling, there's a lot of interesting ideas we've heard today. I appreciate the work that people like George and the Center for Food Safety have done to help us better understand what's in our food. There's always more to the story of our food, and oftentimes we just need it a little more in our face, even if it is just some text on a label. Besides, we've got to have something to read while we eat, right? The Dark Side of Dining is a production of Food for Thought Audio. This episode was written, produced, and edited by me, Kenny Mears. I'd like to thank today's guest, George Kimbrell, for his insights. You can find more about George and the Center for Food Safety at centerforfoodsafety.org. Please be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And until next time, thanks for listening.